Hello everyone and welcome to something that is going to be rather completely different from normal. We are here to play Spelunky, specifically to do the October 14th, 2013 daily challenge. However, that is not what the commentary of this video is going to focus on. The main thing that I want to focus on here is the fact that I managed to play some of the Dark Souls 2 beta last night, and would like to talk about it a little bit, for those of you who are interested. And since, you know, there's an NDA on videos, pictures, etc. of the game, although I know there are people out there who are breaking it and you could go watch those, I do want to provide my own take on certain things in a way that does not break said NDA. So, first of all, I'd like to say that my time with Dark Souls 2 started out very poorly. For whatever reason, I forgot how you make a torch, which is to toggle your option at the bonfire and use that to make a torch. So the first area you come to is this big cave that is extremely dark. If you don't have a torch, you can pretty much see a foot in front of your face even with brightness maxed out. And, you know, it's, there are a lot of holes and stuff you can fall into, a lot of places where you can die just from falling down. As a whole, if you don't remember how to make a torch, you're not going to enjoy the first segment. I spent probably the first 45 minutes to an hour of the beta in that first area, trying to inch my way along, bit by bit. I'm going to use a bomb here real quick. Trying to inch my way along a bit by bit, because I could not remember how to make a torch. And you know, when I was standing by the bonfire and I saw the toggle option, my first thought was that there were blood stains nearby because there was a cliff right behind it, or messages. I didn't actually think that it was how you lit a torch. So that was one thing that kind of threw me off. It kind of put me in the same position as playing through Dark Souls 1, when I thought that you had to go to the cemetery first. For those of you who played Dark Souls and made that same mistake, when you first start out the game, it says you can go up or down, and the closest thing you can find when it comes to moving through the game is the cemetery. So I, myself, among a lot of players from what I understand, initially started out by trying to go through the cemetery, which is meant to be a later game area, or at least an area where once you have enough experience you can do it early. But it's not something that is meant to be done early on your first playthrough, because it is very difficult. The skeletons respawn. You have to be very careful to actually make it through that area without any kind of leveled up equipment. So, it reminded me of that, where I was just getting extremely frustrated with the game, extremely annoyed by the fact that I couldn't make progress, not because enemies were killing me, but because it was so dark that I couldn't see where I was going. It even got to one point where I was running through the cave and I actually managed to make it to the exit for the first time. Well, then I'm outside, it's a bit brighter, but I'm not sure which direction to go. So I start walking around, I find a new cave tender, I go in, make my way through it. It's really dark again, because once again, you're supposed to have a torch while you're in there. And when I walk through, I end up seeing a bonfire, resting at it, and then realizing that it was the first bonfire of the game, where I had started out. So that was like, I wanted to cry a little bit. I finally found my way to a bonfire, and it was the one that I had already been to. Essentially what happened was I found my way into the path that you were supposed to take through the cave, not the secret path that had, a really cool new type of booby-trapped chest. So instead of finding my way to the new area, I just found myself right back to the start and had to redo the whole thing over again with all the enemies respawning because I had rested at the bonfire not paying attention. So that was like the most horrible moment of the beta for me, was all of a sudden being right back where I started after having gone through all that and having nothing I could do except for go through it again. Luckily I did end up getting through it. I did end up finding the next bonfire, which was rather easy to get to after you, when you got out of the cave. I just took the wrong path, not realizing there was a path that led to where I already had been. But yeah, I found the right path pretty easily. I got myself moved on. The thing is that once I got to that next bonfire, it was much better lighting around that bonfire, and I saw that there was a choice to toggle without any bloodstains or messages nearby, and realized, ooh, wow, and realized that that was where I was supposed to go, so to speak. I mean, that was how you were supposed to make a torch. That's what I'm looking for. So once I realized that, it definitely made me feel stupid for the earlier part of my gameplay. Which is something that Dark Souls is extremely good at doing, for those of you who have not played it before. Dark Souls has a thing for making you feel really dumb once you figure out what you're supposed to be doing. But, you know, I figured it out there because it was not as dark and I could actually see what was going on, to see there were no bloodstains around. But the first area in its own right, even before that cave, was dark enough where it was kind of hard to tell that there was nothing around the toggle that you would normally expect to be there in Dark Souls 1. But regardless, I made it through there. In terms of the actual combat of that early part, even without being able to see, you know, Dark Souls 1 skills very much carried over. The low-level enemies weren't giving me any kind of a problem. The hollows I was fighting were very much easily defeated. You know, it was with my warrior, who is the class I picked, I was able to, with my longsword, for the most part, just endless combo each hollow to death. You started at level 20, by the way, so your stats weren't base level quite. But yeah, I mean, with my warrior I was able to take 4 swings at the enemies and kill them without problem. But, you know, the second segment where you fall down the pit if you aren't paying attention, which normally kills you unless you have very good or very learned aim, or you find the mushrooms I eventually found that let you go down there without getting hurt, which was real nice. Before that I was jumping down and landing on the wall partway down the cave, at which point I was able to, okay, the black market is right by the start here, at which point I was able to, oh god, sorry, at which point I was able to, you know, take them out pretty easily. But there are definitely more multi-combat areas where you don't really have a choice. That same first segment where I was trapped on top of I'm trapped in the bottom of the cave, where I didn't really have an option of how to get through. I was kind of, every time you fell down there were 3 hollows that were going to attack you. There was no way to draw them one at a time. They were just going to attack you all at once. So there is definitely an element, or a bigger element I should say, of unavoidable encounters where you have to take on multiple enemies at once. You don't really have a way to draw them, which is not a bad thing for sure. You know, if you've played Dark Souls enough, you can pretty much, throughout PvP, draw every enemy one at a time throughout the game. There's a jetpack in that gambling house. I'm glad we, as usual, are going to be robbing the black market. We are going to buy the shotgun to make this a little bit easier. And then we're going to come here and we're just going to shoot. But yeah, so, you know, if you've played Dark Souls 1 enough, you know that you can pretty easily draw out each group of enemies one at a time and kill them before they have a chance to gang up on you. It seems like Dark Souls 2 will have a bit more of an element of forcing you to take on multiple enemies at once instead of, you know, dragging them out one by one. But at the same time, it didn't really feel like a problem with the hollows. There was one point where there are these sickle knights, who are these huge dudes who have big sickles as weapons, and those guys managed to cause me a huge amount of trouble when they started to gang up on me. There were like 3 or 4 of them in the first area where I encountered them, and when I tried to get to them, you know, sometimes you would accidentally draw out more than you planned to, And if they ganged up on you like 3 or 4 at a time, you didn't have much of a choice but to just suck it up and die. I'm sure you could get away from them, I probably did at some points, but at the same time, you were pretty much completely unable to... I don't know how that guy just died. Not complaining though. You were pretty much able to take them on one at a time decently, easily, if you found their patterns and found out how you should go about attacking them. But if they did gang up on you like that, they did get quite difficult. Oh god. As a whole, the difficulty level in Dark Souls 2 is definitely still there, like you would expect it to be from a Dark Souls game. You know, maybe there are a few segments that are a little bit easier to pick up, but in terms of actual difficulty of gameplay, oh, fuck me. But in terms of actual difficulty of gameplay, that is definitely still right where it has been in the past. You might still run across situations where, you know the area well enough to get through it without problem, but the first time you fight enemies that are bigger than basic hollows, you're gonna have some time adjusting to their patterns. You know, I think I did kill the first Black Knight, not Black Knight, Sickle Knight. I think I did kill him. I was right by that honey too. But yeah, I did manage to kill the first Sickle Knight I faced pretty easily. But at the same time, they were enemies that were not quite so easy to take on as you would maybe expect from an enemy that's, you know, one of the earlier things you take on. Presumably the beta takes place further on in the game than, you know, right at the very beginning, so it's not really something that you would take on right away. But for the beta situation, where this is one of the earlier things you're seeing, it definitely ramps up pretty quickly. But at the same time, there was still that persisting feeling of fairness to the combat, where if you died, it wasn't because the enemies were overpowered, it wasn't because you were underpowered, it was because you didn't handle the enemies well. And that is a big thing in the Souls series that I am happy to see persisting just fine, because that is definitely something that was a bit of a worry with some of the talk about how things were going to be in the new beta, and in the new version. But I think my fears have mostly been alleviated on that point. I think honestly what was a bigger worry to me was the fact that I was not paying as close attention as I should have. In large part that's because I had other obligations that night, so my focus wasn't entirely on the beta. It was more so on the other stuff I had going on that was more important to me. Got the Kafala, awesome. I mean, it can't be a hell run because I accidentally died and lost my Ankh, but at least we're gonna have a good run. But anyway, so, you know, I had other obligations. I wasn't paying quite as much attention to the beta as I probably could have. But what that doesn't change is the fact that I did pay enough attention to mess around with things. What it does change is the fact that I wasn't looking at the things that you need to be looking at in Dark Souls, so to speak. What I mean by that is, like, I got his Wayhander, which is, you know, an item that I used a lot of in the original Dark Souls, on my original Strength character playthrough, which was what I did for my first run through of the game, was a highly Strength-based build. So it's a weapon that I was very familiar with, but what I forgot to do was check if I had put enough points into Strength to use it properly. And from what I understand, both from what my experience kind of tells me, as well as from the things I've heard from others, is that Dark Souls 2 actually allows you to use the whole moveset of an item, even if you don't have the stats to wield it properly. So, even though I may not have had the stats to use this Wayhander properly, I was able to use it just as I would if I did. And so, essentially what I think happened that drove me a little bit crazy was the fact that you know, it was extraordinarily slow, and very much, you know, dangerous to even use. and not doing the damage that I thought I should have for the penalty to the attack speed and everything. But what I really found out eventually was the fact that I probably didn't have the stats needed to use it properly, and so a lot of my qualms with it were more so based on the fact that I wasn't using the item properly than they were on the item balance itself. But yeah, you know, not checking the stats for that is a big problem, because that's a basic of Souls games, is the fact that you need to pay attention to your stats, the stats the items have. It's one thing that I think Dark Souls 2 did change in a way that I understand the change, but I think it's for the worse. Essentially, since you're able to use the full moveset of an item when you can't use it effectively, instead of being able to two-hand it or not use it, as you could in the past Dark Souls, it kind of takes away that visceral notice to the fact that you aren't a high enough level to be using these items. You know, in Dark Souls 1, if you used, let's use the Zweihander. If you use the Zweihander when you had not enough strength to use it, you know, it would have a little cross out over it. It would be limited where you couldn't actually attack with it remotely effectively seeming. It was very blatant, the visual effects of not being able to effectively use the item when you didn't have the stats needed to use it. In Dark Souls 2, it seems more like it looks like you can use it fine, but there are differences to how it gets used and how much damage it does as your stats approach the required level, and then obviously when they scale beyond it. It seems almost like, I would say, more of a scaling factor to, almost more of a scaling factor to the low part of the weapon when your stats are too low, than it feels like not being able to really use it, which is how the last game was. So I understand that change. I think it makes sense to kind of open it up where if you want to, you can take less bonus for a, less bonus on your attacks, or less damage and slower attack speed on your attacks if you're willing to use them before you have the stats proper. Oh god, there goes that run. I don't know why my jetpack didn't go when I told it to. Hey, I'm number 1 right now. Woo! Number 1! Number 1! That's not gonna last long. Anyway, but yeah, Dark Souls had a very effective method of showing you visibly when your stats were too low. Dark Souls 2, I mean, maybe this Zweihander is just really slow attacking and doesn't do as much damage as I would expect it to do, but I don't think that's very likely. You know, I was doing a backstab with the Zweihander, which is slightly different from the backstab with the longsword the warrior starts with. Instead of doing two slashes that do increasing damage, it does one big slash. But that one big slash alone was less damage when I did a backstab than the first slash with the longsword. So I think at that point, even without having to remember to check the stats even by the end of the beta, I think by that point we can pretty much reasonably assume that my stats were not high enough to use that weapon. But there was no way, there wasn't quite as visceral a feel to it. For whatever reason I didn't think to check the stats, but what I did do was stop using the Zweihander because I realized I probably can't use this item effectively because I am just not doing enough damage with it to be worth the time it's taking to swing. So you know, I still got that point, and that point was still got across to me, but it wasn't as visceral and as clear as it was in the original Dark Souls. Which I think is kind of a negative change as a whole. Not that it's a big negative or something that won't be easy to get used to. It's just before, you know, even if you didn't pay attention to the messages about it, you could just equip a weapon you got when you got it, and if you could swing it with one hand, it worked. You had the stats for it. If you couldn't, you didn't. In Dark Souls 2, you're going to have to pay a lot more attention to the stats before you equip the item in order to know that it's able to be used effectively. I can see the benefits of that, I can. I just don't know if it is the choice that I would have made personally. Let's see, what else happened while I was playing? I did run into both an invasion and a summoning. The summoning actually happened by accident. I forgot that I was playing as the warrior, who, in Dark Souls 2, at least in the beta, the warrior starts in a covenant called the Guardians, who start with this ring, kind of like the Cat Covenant ring, if you remember that from Dark Souls 1, where you can get automatically summoned to another player's world. But in this case, it is to defend them from invaders rather than to evade them and try to kill them. So, coming from the perspective of me, who kind of didn't realize that that's exactly what the ring did, I was in a position where I was playing through, and just kind of all of a sudden I saw a loading screen. It was very fast, mind you. When I got summoned to that other world, I didn't even have time to take note of what the message on the bottom of the screen said. All of a sudden it was just a loading screen and I was in this other world after a few seconds, which was really, really cool. The summoning seems to work great when it works. I didn't mess around with it too much because, again, having other obligations, I didn't want to, take something that was going to either hurt the experience for someone else or distract me too much from what else I had going on. So I tried to stick to single player as much as I could, which I know isn't the most descriptive way to handle talking about it, but I think it was probably the most fair to other players. But yeah, when I got summoned, it was very quick. Admittedly, I did not realize that my whole goal there was to help him with the Phantom. I actually thought that I had dropped my summon sign accidentally and was there to help him with the world. The interesting thing about that was that as a Blue Phantom who was summoned from the Guardians, I could not interact with the, what am I looking for? With the enemies from the, user's world who I was summoned into. Because I was summoned to deal with the invasion, the only thing I was able to interact with, and I didn't actually get over in time, I didn't actually find the invader before he died, was the invader. And so, I saw the guy who I was supposed to be helping, and he was over by a couple of the hollows in the game, and I was trying to help him out with those and wondering why I couldn't hit him. And I realized later it's because the Covenant Ring means that I am to help out with invaders and nothing else. So it is a nice touch that they kind of have put in that, what am I looking for? They have put in that ability to limit Blue Phantoms to situational use, as Red Phantoms have always been limited. If you were a Red Phantom in Dark Souls, you couldn't go into the world and help the user to destroy the enemies in the area. The enemies were all not aggroed by you, they were all immune to you, and so you were able to just kind of walk through them and not get hurt. And it's the same thing in the Dark Souls 2 beta with this Guardian Covenant, where if you are summoned to deal with an invader, the game takes away the other obstacles to you helping with the goal that you're there for. So instead of having to worry about if you are going to die to enemies before you actually help them fend off the invasion, you're able to... Oops, I knew that was going to happen too. I don't know why I jumped like that. But you're able to just focus on what you're there for instead of spending a lot of time focusing on getting rid of the enemies so you can get to that point. I think that's a real nice touch, quite frankly. I think it is something that is going to open up possibilities for how Blue Phantoms are used, which is a very nice thing to have because, as it said, summoning a Phantom was pretty much just help me until we get to the boss and beat it, and once we do, you're going to disappear, and there's no other real use to you other than doing these very specific things. Now with the beta, and what it appears they've allowed for, at least in terms of Dark Souls 2, you now have that ability to... Oops. They now have that ability to set up enemies to... and set up summonings to do specific things instead of focusing them on one overarching thing that is applied to everything. So I think that is something that is a very nice touch. I quite enjoyed that mechanic when I was playing with it, for sure. I also faced off against an invasion myself. Once again, invasions were much quicker seeming. It seemed like there was less delay between when the message appeared on my screen that I was being invaded and when the invader was there. So I think that is something that is going to make it a lot scarier when you start to see that message. Is you aren't really going to have the time to react and plan and clear the area while, you know, Dark Spirit blah is being summoned to your world. It's more like, okay, Dark Spirit is being summoned to my world. Where are they? Let's go. You know, when I had an enemy summoned on me, or not summoned on me, but when I had someone invade me, I still had a couple of hollows alive around me, and they were already there before I could handle the hollows. So it was something where I very much needed to react in the moment and handle the invasion at the same time as I was handling these enemies that were already there that were from PvE. I think that also is a nice touch. It's going to make invasions something a lot more threatening, especially for experienced players who are able to clear out areas before the enemies get into them. It'll change things up where they kind of have to be a little bit more wary when they see an invasion happening, because they won't necessarily have time to clear out all those enemies and make it so that they can survive easily. In terms of the actual invasion itself, I was a warrior. I was facing off against a sorcerer. I felt like the combat there was very balanced. It may just be me, but it seemed like my shield was much more effective against magic than shields were in Dark Souls 1. I think that goes a long way toward making magic something that can be more viable in terms of PvP. Well, I mean, it's viable as it is. Actually, it's very good as it is. But that's the thing, is that, you know, if you want to make magic something more in-depth, like the item systems are, as it stood in Dark Souls 1, the magic was kind of a little bit on the strong side, because you were in a position where shields weren't blocking as much of your damage as they were of physical damage, where, you know, things just weren't equipped as well to handle what you were throwing at them. I think in Dark Souls 2 it has kind of taken the approach of balancing that out a little bit more, so that, you know, shields block more of magic, which makes it more of a thing that can have the light and heavy attacks they have now, and such like that. I think it's a very nice thing in terms of balance. On the other hand, I did almost feel kind of overpowered against said mage. You know, I think I was barely taking damage when I would take a hit, and taking hits wasn't all that common. You know, I should get up here and get this hired help, because, oh god. Because if I get the hired help, then I can get a Kapala on this floor. Sorry, I still have to give some game commentary at some points. But, 10,000 down the drain, unfortunately. But where was I? Yeah, in terms of actual feeling like it was balanced, I really did. Free jetpack, awesome. I feel like it was something that was pretty much better in terms of how warriors and melee classes can handle magic than it was in the past. At the same time, however, I do question if now magic is a little bit harder to use. And what I mean by that is not that it is, you know, significantly worse, but my shield was blocking a lot of his attacks in a way that I really didn't expect it to. And so I wonder if it is something that is going to make it where, you know, magic is not quite as powerful as it could be. If that makes sense to you. You know, when I'm blocking the vast majority of his magic damage with my shield, you know, it's taking him time to charge up, although weapon attacks do take longer to recover from. Oh. Weapon attacks do take longer to recover from whether you are... whether you are successful in hitting or not. If you hit a shield, it takes longer to recover, obviously, but it takes longer than it used to recover from a successful hit as well. So it is kind of balanced by the changes to the melee combat. Similarly, the fact that if you are locked on, you actually move slower now. So your strafing speed is not as fast as it once was when you are... Oh yeah, I didn't end up getting Kapala. Why am I trying to collect blood? Your strafing speed isn't as fast when you are locked on as your movement speed is when you're not. So now there is kind of a balance to be struck between what's more important to you, locking on to the enemies so that you can see, and so you can keep the camera on them, or having more freedom of movement while you're trying to evade attacks. This is something that is going to take a lot of getting used to for people who have played a lot of Dark Souls. Quite frankly, it is very off-putting at first, because here you are having played a lot of Dark Souls expecting to be able to kind of walk circles around your enemies, but when it comes right down to it, when you're using the lock-on, which is the only way to really strafe instead of just moving around normally, you're moving significantly slower when you're moving around, so it does give you a little bit of a disadvantage to that advantage of locking on, which is a kind of weird balancing thing that I didn't expect. Similarly, there is a new lock-on system available, which I don't think was one I had set up, but it may have been because I think it only applies to great swords and I didn't use too many of them. Or use them for too long, I guess is a better way to put it. But yeah, there is a new lock-on system where instead of, you know, always being facing your opponent, you can have it where you can move around freely while locked on, and the camera stays on the opponent, but your character doesn't always face them. That's a very big change that is going to take a lot of getting used to. I don't know, didn't really mess around with it during the beta myself, but I have heard a lot of people say that it's not bad once you get used to it, it just takes a lot of getting used to. Other than that, I think the main thing that I want to comment on is the fact that, crap, what was I gonna say? We're gonna do a speedrun real quick while I try to come up with this. The one last thing I want to add is the fact that throughout the game, throughout the beta time I spent, it was very much Dark Souls, you know what I mean? With all these changes and everything, it is kind of a worry, but it was very much the same game. You know, it was actually in some ways more difficult with the changes, not the least of which because in addition to that lock-on slowdown, enemies in PvE make a much bigger point of turning around to try to stop you from doing backstabs. So it took me ages at first, just kind of going one-on-one with a couple of follows to try to work out a backstab. Whereas, you know, Dark Souls 1 at this point, after playing it as much as I have, it's pretty much second nature to me to just be able to walk in and... Oh god, really? To be able to just walk in and do, just walk in and do a backstab first try. Dark Souls 2 is going to take a little bit more effort, even in PvE, not just because of the slower strafing speeds, but because of the fact that, wow, but because of the fact that enemies are much more adept at turning around on you. You know, that one hollow I was facing off against, you know, it took me a little while to get the time and get the aim down, because I was used to, after they attack, trying to just walk around behind them and attack. Now it's actually a timing thing of having to pay attention to where you are in relation to their back, because they don't stay turned around as long as they used to. Obviously a very good thing that's going to make PvE much more satisfying, much more interesting to try to pull off those maneuvers in. I'm happy with that change. But it's once again something that takes some getting used to, and at the start makes the game a little bit more difficult than it is once you are used to it. You know, once I got used to it, I was pulling off backstabs no problem, because I was paying attention to the enemy's looks instead of, you know, knowing how to move to make it happen. That's just the general matter of learning that comes with Dark Souls, Demon Souls, etc. But it is definitely something that is very apparent when you are playing through for the first time. So that is something that I think is going to be interesting to see how it works in PvP, especially considering you can now get hit in during backstabs, and because of the free camera, because of the free attack movement by the new lock-on system, that similarly means that someone can turn around while you're behind them and starting a backstab and hit you out of it. And not only hit you out of it, but open you up for another bigger attack. So it is a big change by the fact that those aren't invincible anymore. In terms of parries and ripostes, I tried to a little bit. I was never all that great with it in Dark Souls 1. It was one skill that I never really practiced as much as I should have. But, yeah, it was definitely doable. I don't know if I ever actually landed the riposte, but I did land a couple of parries and have a very, you know, the enemies end up kneeling down in front of you, giving you the time for the riposte, at least in terms of the PvE ones I came up against. I couldn't quite get the riposte off, but I did manage to find it, you know. So it is a different system yet again, but also not a bad system. Compass would be nice, spike shoes would be nice. Sorry, kind of getting distracted by game right now. Ooh, there we go, there we go. Anyway, so yeah, you know, those systems are a little bit different. The backstab animations are real nice, by the way. And it's something you're going to have to pay attention to and get used to when you start, but I think it's very good. As a whole, if you have not been able to tell from my talk here, this is a game that I am still very much hyped for, probably even more so than before. I cannot wait till the 26th to spend another few hours with it. They actually left the servers on for an extra hour, so instead of getting 2 hours with it, we got 3, which was nice. It gave us more time to experiment. But yeah, the next time I am going to focus a lot more on as the test is made for, focus a lot more on the PvP elements and stuff, most likely, as well as trying to make more progress now that I know how to make a torch, can get through the first area in a reasonable amount of time, etc. So that's going to do it for my first talk on the Dark Souls 2 beta. I hope you enjoyed listening to me blabber on about this. I am very hyped for the game. I think you should be too. And I will see you on the next episode of whatever's here, and I will definitely do another episode like this of something come the time when that second beta goes on, to talk about what I find out in that one. Thank you guys as always for watching, and I will see you next time. Later, everyone.